Session 610. A number of events, foremost among them the death of Jane's mother after an illness of many years, caused us to lay these sessions aside after Seth finished his preface on April the 10th. Jane did manage to hold her ESP and writing classes part of the time. She also worked on her novel, The Education of Oversoul 7, which she discusses in her introduction. Through it all, however, we looked forward to our daily participation in Seth's new book. Jane hadn't looked at Seth Speaks for long periods during its production in order to avoid conscious involvement with it. But, she said recently, smiling, she plans to read and use this work session by session as she delivers it. Whatever nervousness she'd felt about producing it was minimal by now. I encouraged her new free attitude. And I'm going to skip a little of this. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now for dictation. The first chapter is entitled The Living Picture of the World. The living picture of the world grows within the mind. The world as it appears to you is like a three-dimensional painting in which each individual takes a hand. Each color, each line that appears within it has first been painted within a mind, and only then does it materialize without. In this case, however, the artists themselves are a portion of the painting and appear within it. There is no effect in the exterior world that does not spring from an inner source. There is no motion that does not first occur within the mind. The great creativity of consciousness is your heritage. It does not belong to mankind alone, however. Each living being possesses it, and the living world consists of a spontaneous cooperation that exists between the smallest and the highest, the greatest and the lowest, and the lowly, between the atoms and the molecules and the conscious reasoning mind. All manner of insects, birds, and beasts cooperate in this venture, producing the natural environment. This is as normal and inevitable as the fact that your breath causes a mist to form on glass if you breathe upon it. All consciousness creates the world rising out of feeling tone. It is a natural product of what your consciousness is. Feelings and emotions emerge into reality in certain specific ways. Thoughts appear growing on the bed already laid. The seasons spring up, formed by ancient feeling tones, having deep and abiding rhythms. They are the result, again, of innate creative aspects that are a portion of all life. These ancient aspects lie, now, deeply buried in the psyches of all species, and from them the individual patterns, the specific blueprints for new differentiations emerge. The body of the earth can be said to have its own soul, or mind, whatever term you prefer. Using this analogy, the mountains and oceans and valleys and rivers and all natural phenomena spring from the earth's soul, as all events and all manufactured objects appear from the inner mind or soul of mankind. The inner world of each man and woman is connected with the inner world of the earth. The spirit becomes flesh. Part of each individual soul, then, is intimately connected with what we will call the world soul, or the soul of the earth. The smallest blade of grass or flower is aware of this connection, and without reasoning comprehends its position, its uniqueness, and its source of vitality. The atoms and molecules that compose all objects, whether it be the body of a person, a table, a stone, or a frog, know the great passive thrust of creativity that lies beneath their own existence, and upon which their individuality floats, distinct, clear, and unassailable. so does the human individual rise up in victorious distinctiveness from the ancient and yet ever new fountains of his own soul. The self rises from unknowing into knowing, constantly surprising itself. As you read these sentences, for example, some of your knowledge is conscious knowing and is instantly available. Some is unconscious, but even the unconscious knowledge is knowing in its own unknowing. You always know what you are doing, even when you do not realize it. Your eye knows it sees, though it cannot see itself except through the use of reflection. In the same way, the world as you see it is a reflection of what you are, a reflection not in glass, but in a three-dimensional reality. You project your thoughts, feelings, and expectations outward, then you perceive them as the outside reality. When it seems to you that others are observing you, you are observing yourself from the standpoint of your own projections. Now you may take a break. Now you are the living picture of yourself. You project what you think you are outward into flesh. Your feelings, your conscious and unconscious thoughts all alter and form your physical image. This is fairly easy for you to understand. It is not as easy, however, to realize that your feelings and thoughts form your exterior experience in the same way, or that the events that appear to happen to you are initiated by you within your mental or psychic inner environment. Your body does not just happen to be thin or fat, tall or short, healthy or ill. These characteristics are mental and are thrust outward by you upon your image. I do not mean to be facetious, but you were not born yesterday. Your soul was not born yesterday in those terms, but before the annals of time, as you think of time. The characteristics that were yours at birth were yours for a reason. The inner self chose them. To a large extent, the inner self can even now alter many of them. You did not arrive at birth without a history. Your individuality was always latent within your soul, and the history that is a part of you is written within unconscious memory that resides not only within your psyche, but is faithfully decoded in your genes and chromosomes, and fulfilled in the blood that rushes through your veins. You are aware, alert, and participating in many more realities than you know, as your soul expresses itself through you. That consciousness of your usual daylight hours, the ego consciousness, rises up like a flower from the ground of the underneath, the unconscious bed of your own reality. Though you are not aware of it, this ego itself emerges, then falls back again into the unconscious form, which another ego then arises as a new bloom from the springtime earth. You do not have the same ego now that you had 5 years ago, but you are not aware of the change. Ego rises out of what you are, in other words. It is a part of the action of your being and consciousness. But as the eye cannot see its own shifting colors and expressions, as it is not aware that it lives and dies constantly as its atomic structure changes, so you are not aware that the ego continually changes, dies, and is reborn. Physically, the structure of a cell retains its identity, even while the matter that composes it is continually altered. The cell rebuilds itself in line with its own pattern of identity, yet is always a part of emerging action, alive and responding, even in the midst of its own multitudinous deaths. So, psychological structures form to which various names are given. The names are meaningless, but the structures behind them are not. Such psychological structures also retain their identity, their pattern of uniqueness, even while they change constantly, die, and are reborn. The eye rises out of the physical structure. The ego rises out of the structure of the psyche. It cannot see itself as the eye cannot. Both look outward, in one case away from the physical body, and in the other case away from the inner psyche to the environment. The creative body consciousness creates the I. The creative inner psyche creates the ego. The body forms the I in the splendid wisdom of that great unconscious knowing. The psyche brings forth the ego that perceives psychologically as the I perceives physically. Both the I and the ego are formations focused toward perception of exterior reality. You may take your break. Now, this is not book dictation. Rupert was correct in the insight of a few moments earlier. In my book, we will be going deeper into the nature of the unconscious and the psyche, bringing out some concepts that are of great value. Rupert himself, unconsciously but also, to some extent consciously, has been more intrigued with questions concerning consciousness and personality, the role of the ego consciousness, for example, since beginning his novel Oversoul 7. Much is not as yet known. Your psychologists are not able to think in terms of a soul, and your religious leaders are not able or refuse to comprehend it psychologically, even to its simplest degree. Metaphysics and psychology have not met, in other words. Now, I am, as I have told you often myself, independent of Rupert. As you know, there are connections between us. He does not understand as yet the true nature of his own creativity. Few people do. There are always psychological reasons for all such phenomena, for any phenomena at all. In some respects, of course, Rupert's children are his books. His psyche is enormously creative. Part of what I seem to be as I speak through him is as deeply and unconsciously a phenomena as the birth of a child would be. In a different way, so is Oversoul 7, as he thinks of it. These are not physical children at the mercy of time and of the elements, but eternal ones, more knowledgeable than the parent, God springing from the human psyche, half human, half divine. And on this level the parent is astonished, delighted at the superior accomplishments of its children, the superiority of the offspring, and yet also jealous to some extent. If the books are children symbolically, then in those same terms his representation of my reality is a far more living, three-dimensional aspect. He has at various times wondered about schizophrenia. For example, he does not realize that on this level now, and regardless of my independence and other issues involved, that he creates the personalities free of time, organizes them under the leadership of the conscious mind, and assigns them tasks of great validity and importance, which are then carried out. This is creativity of a most specialized nature, and allows him to probe, if he will, into the nature of consciousness, the psyche, and creativity in a way that few can. Now he himself set up the conditions that would make such results possible. A certain part of my reality is a portion of a certain part of his reality, and here the creation of what I seem to be takes place. Beyond that is my own independent reality. I will have more to say and add to those notes so that they will build up by themselves. If Rupert would regard his problems as challenges, then he would get much better results. That is all for now, and I bid you a fond good evening. The same to you, Seth. Thank you. Come to our class sometime. And then there's just notes that Rob made. And I will read a little bit of it. In answer to many queries, and this is Robert speaking here, I'll explain here why I prefer to write these sessions down instead of using a recorder. Shortly after Seth began to speak through Jane in late 1963, we tried recording the material, but I soon learned that I can type a session from my notes a lot faster than I can from a tape. This is very important since all of our psychic work is done at night after we've already put in a full day writing and painting and carrying out all those other actions connected with just living in an organized way. Yet, I've had to modify my schedule in order to find the additional time required for the preparation of this manuscript. I paint in the mornings and do this work in the afternoons. When Jane speaks to me as Seth, her delivery is slower than it is during a class session, for instance. This, along with Seth's own instructions, makes punctuation easy. The copy is concise. After an occasional correction, it's ready for production. Moreover, I feel that the fact that such high-quality work is obtained this way says important things about these sessions. After holding the first session for this chapter, Jane wrote intently on Oversoul 7 and did some work on a long-range project that she tentatively calls Aspect Psychology. Then, just before we were to resume work on Seth's book, the Great Flood of Friday, June the 23rd, 1972, took place. The flood was the worst on record in this section of the country. It grew out of Tropical Storm Agnes, which, somewhat ironically, had lost its hurricane status by the time it began its erratic course up the east coast from Florida. Agnes was preceded by days of heavy rain that extended on a broad front for hundreds of miles. The storm unexpectedly veered inland after picking up new strength off of the Virginia Capes, and when it stalled over New York and Pennsylvania, flooding became inevitable. Jane and I decided to remain behind when finally last-minute requests to evacuate our section of Elmira were made before dawn. Our decision, of course, contained deeply symbolic meanings for us that we still only partially understand. The Chemung River passes less than a block from our apartment house on its way through the center of the city. But since we live on the second floor, we thought we'd be secure. The house was solid, we decided. The neighborhood emptied itself except for us and became extremely quiet. The water, thick with topsoil, excluded a near-suffocating odor of petroleum effluents. Became 1 foot deep in the yard, then 3, then 5. Jane and I found ourselves experiencing a drastic new world, and although Seth hasn't said so yet, I believe that to be one of the reasons we stayed. We sipped wine and used light self-hypnosis to take the edge off of our tension. But as we watched the water crawl up the side of the old red brick house next door, our new reality threatened to turn into a terrifying one indeed, had we made the right decision. By now, escape was probably impossible. I suggested that Jane tune in psychically to see what she could learn about our situation. It's hard to be calm when you're already scared, she said, but began to compose herself. Gradually, she attained a very relaxed state. She told me that the water would reach its highest level late that afternoon. Incredibly, it would become almost 10 feet deep in the yard and reach halfway up the first floor windows of the house next to ours. We would be safe as long as we stayed where we were. Jane sounded awed, though, when she said that the Walnut Street Bridge would go. I was awed, too, since the old steel bridge crossed the Chemung River less than half a block from us. We couldn't see it because of the houses across the street. As soon as Jane had picked up this information, we began to feel better. We ate, played cards, and periodically checked the water level. Several hours passed. The flood crested within 15 minutes of the time Jane had given, and within 3 inches of her projected high water mark. We slept that evening, knowing that the water was dropping quickly. The next morning I walked over to the Walnut Street Bridge. It had been destroyed. Several of its spans had been washed out. We were lucky compared to many others in the city. We'd lost our car, but we had a place to live and had all of our paintings, manuscripts, and records, including the 53 volumes of the Seth material, intact. Since we occupied 2 apartments in order to have enough living and working space, we had room to take in a couple who had been flooded out. The weather was cold and rainy. Our days became a routine of actions devoted to survival, although Jane finished Oversoul 7 early in July and resumed her classes. This book was put aside for a long time. In August, Jane held 1 session on the flood, in which Seth had time to just touch upon the reasons behind our personal involvement in it. And late that month and in September, we had several house guests in connection with psychic work. One of them was Richard Bosch, author of the very successful book Jonathan Livingston Seagull. When she felt it was time to resume work on Seth's book, Jane discovered to her surprise that she was somewhat nervous about it. Yet, speaking for Seth, she resumed dictation so smoothly that it seemed there hadn't been any such thing as a 3-month lapse. Good evening. Good evening, Seth. Now give us a moment, and we will resume dictation. Your experience in the world of physical matter flows outward from the center of your inner psyche. Then you perceive this experience. Exterior events, circumstances, and conditions are meant as a kind of living feedback. Altering the state of the psyche automatically alters the physical circumstances. There is no other valid way of changing physical events. It might help if you imagine an inner living dimension within yourself in which you create, in miniature psychic form, all the exterior conditions that you know. Simply put, you do exactly this. Your thoughts, feelings, and mental pictures can be called incipient exterior events. For in one way or another, each of these is materialized into physical reality. You change even the most permanent seeming conditions of your life constantly through the varying attitudes you have toward them. There is nothing in your exterior experience that did not originate within you. Interactions with others do occur, of course, yet there are none that you do not accept or draw to you by your thoughts, attitudes, or emotions. This applies in each area of life. In your terms, it applies both before life and after it. In the most miraculous fashion are you given the gift of creating your experience. In this existence, you are learning to handle the inexhaustible energy that is available to you. The mass condition of the world and the situation of each individual in it is the materialization of man's progress as he forms his world. The joy of creativity flows through you as effortlessly as your breath. From it, the most minute areas of your outer experience spring. Your feelings have electromagnetic realities that rise outward, affecting the atmosphere itself. They group through attraction, bringing up areas of events and circumstances that finally coalesce, so to speak, either in matter as objects or as events in time. Some feelings and thoughts are translated into structures that you call objects. These exist in your terms in a medium you call space. Others are translated instead into psychological structures called events that seem to exist in a medium you call time. Space and time are both root assumptions, which simply means that man man accepts both and assumes that his reality is rooted in a series of moments and a dimension of space. So your inner experience is translated in those terms. Even the duration of an event or object in space or time is determined by the intensity of the thoughts or emotions that gave it birth. Duration in space is not the same as duration in time, however, though it may seem that that is the case. I am speaking in your terms now. An event or object that exists briefly in space may have a much greater duration in time. It may have far greater importance and intensity, existing in your memory, for example, long after it has disappeared in space. Such an event or object does not merely exist symbolically within your mind or memory, but in your terms, its actual reality continues as a time event. Nor is its reality in space annihilated as long as it exists within your mind. Let us take a very simple example. A child has been told not to play with a doll. The order is disobeyed. The child, wittingly or unwittingly, breaks the doll, and it is finally thrown away. The doll exists in the time quite vitally as long as the child or the adult to be remembers it. If the doll sat on a bureau, and this is also vitally recalled, then the space in which the doll sat still carries the impression of the doll, though other objects may be placed there. You react, therefore, not only to what is visible to your physical eyes in space, or to what is directly in front of you in time, but also to objects and events whose reality is still with you, though they may seem to have disappeared. Basically, you create your experience through your beliefs about yourself and the nature of reality. Another way to understand this is to realize that you create your experiences through your expectations. Your feeling tones are your emotional attitudes toward yourself and life in general, and these generally govern the large areas of experience. They give the overall emotional coloration that characterizes what happens to you, period. You are what happens to you. Your emotional feelings are often transitory, but beneath there are certain qualities of feeling uniquely your own that are like deep musical chords. While your day-to-day feelings may rise or fall, these characteristic feelings lie beneath. Sometimes they rise to the surface, but in great long rhythms. You cannot call these negative or positive. They are instead tones of your being. They represent the most inner portion of your experience. This does not mean that they are hidden from you or are meant to be. It simply means that they represent the core from which you form your experience. If you have become afraid of emotion or the expression of feeling, or if you have been taught that the inner self is no more than a repository of uncivilized impulses, then you may have the habit of denying this deep rhythm. You may try to operate as if it did not exist, or even try to refute it, but it represents your deepest, most creative impulses. To fight against it is like trying to swim upstream against a strong current. And I will end this session now and begin again in the third session.